I am from the Department of International Studies at Far Eastern University, and I'm honored to welcome our speakers this afternoon that will help us understand more the relations of Korea's engagement with the region and beyond. So for today, the first presenter is Dr. Maria Thaemar Tana from the Ateneo de Manila University, and she will be presenting to us via video.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present my ongoing research. I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to the UP Korea Research Center and Professor Be for organizing this important event and for kindly allowing me to participate virtually. My presentation explores the evolving strategic roles of Japan and South Korea in Southeast Asia, viewed through the lens of the free and open Indo-Pacific framework. This inquiry unfolds against the backdrop of a rapidly shifting regional order, as the Indo-Pacific, which refers to that vast region spanning two major oceans, the Indian and Pacific, and the countries that border them, becomes the center of global geopolitical competition, particularly between the United States and China. Middle powers are no longer on the sidelines. So they're being called upon to reinforce multilateralism, uphold the rules-based order, and provide regional public goods in ways that promote stability without escalating confrontation. So before I proceed, a quick note on the title. As someone in Japanese studies, I see the free and open Indo-Pacific as a flexible framework. It originated in Tokyo, but it is now reflected in various diplomatic frameworks like ASEAN's Outlook on the Indo-Pacific or the AOIP, US-Japan South Korea dialogues, and South Korea's own Indo-Pacific strategy. They're all emphasize core values of openness, rule of law, and maritime security, as well as connectivity. So when I use the term free and open Indo-Pacific, it is not to imply a uniform or officially shared framework, but rather to analytically capture the broader ecosystem of strategic cooperation that is emerging in the region. While terminology matters, South Korea, for instance, labels its strategy as the action plan for a free, open, and prosperous Indo-Pacific, these initiatives increasingly reflect what might be considered a de facto free and open Indo-Pacific engagement. So my use of the term is not meant to collapse distinct strategies into a single category, but to highlight their growing convergence in terms of values, geographic focus, and strategic intent. Now, my research is guided by three questions. First, how do Japan and South Korea project their strategic influence in Southeast Asia? Second, are their actions in the region primarily competitive, or do we see signs of collaboration emerging? And third, how do unresolved historical disputes, as well as broader structural dynamics, shape their ability to work together? And my argument is this, that while Japan and South Korea do continue to compete, particularly in areas like economic diplomacy and defense cooperation, that competition is increasingly constructive rather than confrontational. And at the same time, we are seeing a gradual convergence around a shared regional agenda, one that champions a rules-based order, values openness and connectivity, and reinforces ASEAN's centrality. This subtle but meaningful alignment is most evident in Southeast Asia, where both Tokyo and Seoul enjoy greater diplomatic flexibility and face fewer historical constraints. The Philippines, in particular, offers a unique diplomatic space where middle power strategies are tested, coordinated, and performed. Okay, now why focus on Japan and South Korea? So, for one, both countries are allies of the United States. They also possess advanced technological capabilities and have a deep rooted presence in the global economy. And by that, I mean they are not only among the world's largest economies, so Japan ranks third and South Korea around 10th globally, but they are also key players in global supply chains and top investors and donors in Asia and beyond. So they're multinational corporations. So, for example, Toyota, Samsung, Sony, and Hyundai are central to global trade flows, and their governments shape international standards on technology, finance, and development. Yet, despite this influence, they are not considered great powers in the traditional sense. They are what we call middle powers. You know? So a middle power is defined as a state that is not a superpower but still exercises significant or international influence through diplomacy, soft power, and multilateral engagement. The middle powers, in essence, are states that exert influence not by coercing or dominating others, but by shaping norms, building coalitions, and providing public goods such as development aid and infrastructure. Recently, scholars have started to describe the evolving strategies of countries like Japan and South Korea as an example of neo middle power diplomacy. So, this is a more proactive and strategic form of diplomacy, one that's carefully calibrated to hedge against great power instability. So we see this in actions like hosting regional summits, aligning with ASEAN priorities, and managing US alliance commitments while also keeping channels open with China. Now, it is important for Tokyo and Seoul to recognize that as middle powers, their global reputations and regional influence hinge on their perception as constructive and credible partners. So, this is true not only in Northeast Asia, where history and geopolitics are complex, but also in Southeast Asia, where they have more room to maneuver, cooperate, and build trust. Okay. So why is the Philippines such a key site for examining Japan-South Korea cooperation in the Indo-Pacific? Well, first, the Philippines, like both Japan and South Korea, is a formal US treaty ally, which makes it a natural partner for strategic initiatives like Japan's FOIP and South Korea's Global Pivotal State or GPS strategy. Both Tokyo and Seoul see Manila as a critical node in sustaining a regional order aligned with US interests, a regional order that is open, rules based, and multilateral. The second reason is that geographically, the Philippines sits right at the front line of the South China Sea disputes. These waters are not just a geopolitical flashpoint, they are a litmus test for principles like freedom of navigation, maritime sovereignty, and international law. Any country serious about Indo-Pacific security cannot afford to overlook the Philippines. Third, the Philippines has a long history of receiving infrastructure, aid, and security assistance, particularly from Japan and increasingly from South Korea. This makes it a highly visible platform for middle power engagement where investments, training, and defense partnerships can be showcased. Also, the Philippines is deeply embedded in ASEAN and has consistently supported regional multilateralism. This aligns with the regional visions of both Japan and South Korea, which place ASEAN centrality at the heart of their Indo-Pacific strategies. But aside from these four main reasons, there's also a historical dimension. So while the Philippines did suffer under Japanese occupation during World War II, its post-war relationship with Japan normalized relatively quickly. And this is thanks to early reparations, sustained development assistance, and strategic cooperation. In contrast to the still unresolved historical tensions between South Korea and Japan, the Philippines therefore offers a low risk, high trust diplomatic environment. So, in this sense, the Philippines acts as a kind of a diplomatic buffer zone. So, it's a space where Japan and South Korea can test, coordinate, and normalize cooperation. No? So, whether through joint aid projects, military training programs, or parallel diplomatic engagements, the Philippines offers a space where both countries can act in concert without triggering backlash rooted in historical trauma. Now let's look into Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific or FOIP strategy. So since former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo first articulated this in 2016, FOIP has evolved into Japan's flagship foreign policy framework, particularly in Southeast Asia, where its influence is most visible. Japan's approach to FOIP rests on four key pillars. First is what Japan calls principles for peace and rules for prosperity. At its core, this means promoting the rule of law, human rights, and a free, rules based economic order. Now, these principles are especially relevant in Southeast Asia, where development gaps and maritime disputes, like that in the South China Sea, make the region vulnerable to unilateral coercion. Second, FOIP promotes addressing challenges in an Indo Pacific way. So instead of imposing universal solutions or one-size-fits-all solutions, Japan prioritizes inclusive region-specific strategies to tackle common issues such as climate change, infectious diseases, and food security. Also, FOIP emphasizes multi-layered connectivity. So this includes physical connectivity through ODA-funded infrastructure, institutional connectivity through better governance, and people-to-people connectivity via education, cultural exchange, and vocational training. And lastly, Japan has begun extending its efforts in security, not just at sea, but increasingly in the air. Now, Japan has expanded its support for Coast Guard training, maritime domain awareness, and strategic security dialogues, no, particularly with partners like the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Now, what's notable or what's interesting is that Japan's FOIP vision has been welcomed by many ASEAN countries. Now, why? Why is this? This probably because FOIP aligns with their own needs, which include infrastructure funding, maritime security, and crucially, regional autonomy. Japan has consistently emphasized that FOIP does not intend to compete with ASEAN, but rather seeks synergy with ASEAN's own vision or outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And this alignment actually strengthens Japan's credibility and positions it as a trusted partner in the region. Now let's turn to South Korea's New Southern Policy, or NSP, which was launched under President Moon Jae-in in 2017 as a cornerstone of Seoul's regional strategy. Now, the goal of the NSP was to diversify and expand South Korea's diplomatic and economic relationships beyond the traditional focus on the Korean Peninsula. It aimed to reposition South Korea as a more active regional player by engaging more deeply with Southeast Asia and India. The NSP was, in fact, readily compatible with Japan's FOIP in terms of economics and diplomacy, except, except that the NSP lacked a robust security dimension. No. Both strategies shared a common focus on ASEAN centrality, infrastructure, and inclusive development, but they diverged on matters related to hard security. And there's a question here: why did South Korea avoid using free and open or the free and open Indo-Pacific terminology? And this is really because of strategic caution, especially with regard to China, which was and still is South Korea's largest trading partner. So when the Indo-Pacific narrative began gaining traction, Seoul deliberately kept its distance from the FOIP terminology. Moon's administration was careful not to present the NSP as an extension of FOIP. So in a sense, we could say Seoul was hedging, and the NSP allowed it to engage diplomatically without being seen as taking sides. But a significant strategic pivot occurred with the election of President Yoon Suk-yeol in 2022. No? And this marked a clear departure from the more cautious posture of the previous administration. Under Yoon, South Korea launched the Global Pivotal State, or GPS strategy, which signaled a bold redefinition of Seoul's regional role. Um, One of Yoon's earliest foreign policy milestones was the release of South Korea's first Indo-Pacific strategy. And for the first time, Seoul explicitly aligned itself with the core principles of Japan's FOIP, championing freedom, openness, and the rule of law as foundational to its regional engagement. And this study also reaffirmed strong support for ASEAN centrality. South Korea pledged expanded investments in agriculture, digital transformation, and maritime cooperation. And in doing so, South Korea has made it clear that it is no longer content to act as a passive bystander. It is now stepping forward as an assertive middle power, one that actively contributes to collective security and the provision of public goods. Notably, as well, the Philippines has emerged as a direct beneficiary of this strategic shift. Under Yoon, South Korea upgraded its relationship with the Philippines to a strategic partnership and committed to supporting the modernization of the Philippine military. And all these illustrate how Seoul is beginning to act not only as a global actor, but as a regional anchor, shaping security, development, and diplomacy in Southeast Asia with renewed confidence. The convergence between Japan and South Korea is playing out most vividly in the Philippines, where they are active in two critical areas: economics and infrastructure, and defense and security. So, in terms of infrastructure, Japan and South Korea operate in parallel, sometimes competing, often complementing. Japan remains the Philippines' top development partner, especially under its FOIP strategy. Through JICA, it has financed major projects like the Metro Manila Subway, providing concessional loans and high quality technology. And these efforts are not just about connectivity, they are strategic. They offer an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So the picture on the right shows the Metro Manila subway construction site with Japanese tunnel boring machines. Now, South Korea, on the other hand, through its new southern policy and the more recent GPS strategy, is also expanding its footprint. Although smaller in scale, it focuses on digital infrastructure, rural development, and vocational training. So projects like the Corfield Training Center in Davao, so featured here on the right, is supported by KOICA, or the Korean International Cooperation Agency. They highlight a more human-centered approach. No? So together, all this create a form of competitive coexistence. And Japan brings legacy and scale. South Korea, on the other hand, offers agility and niche expertise. And for the Philippines, this means broader access to resources and a reduced reliance on a single external power. In terms of defense, both countries are ramping up engagement. So Japan has signed a reciprocal access agreement, or RAA, with the Philippines. So it's first in Asia, third globally, after the UK and Australia, if I'm not mistaken. And this allows joint training, humanitarian response, and enhanced interoperability between their forces. It also deepens Japan's strategic presence and strengthens Manila's position in maritime disputes. So the RAA with Japan actually enhances our deterrence in the West Philippine Sea. So the picture there pictured the signing of the RAA last year. So you have the President Marcos and Secretary of Defense Gibo Teodoro. Now, South Korea, meanwhile, has become the Philippines' top arms supplier, providing FA-50 fighter jets, warships, and potentially submarines. No? So, in sum, I suppose, although there is competition for contracts, visibility, and influence, it is not zero sum. So, in fact, there's a kind of functional division of labor that is emerging. Japan focuses on capacity building, surveillance, and strategic agreements, while South Korea specializes in hardware, platforms, and tactical systems. Now, the United States also plays a catalytic role in shaping the environment in which Japan and South Korea are learning to cooperate. Now, at the 2023 Camp David Trilateral Summit, the US, Japan, and South Korea agreed to a series of forward-looking initiatives. So, this include perhaps annual security consultations, joint military exercises, and a coordinated Indo-Pacific strategy. And these are not only limited to Northeast Asia, they also extend into Southeast Asia. No? Military exercises like the Balikatan and Kamandag as well. So we can see Japan and South Korea operating alongside US and Philippine forces. Now, these exercises, they quietly build operational familiarity between Tokyo and Seoul, not through direct bilateral drills, but through joint participation under a US-led framework. And this creates a functional synergy without the political baggage of a Japan South Korea only engagement. No? Likewise, ASEAN-led forums like the ADMM Plus and the East Asia Summit provide additional space for coordination. So they offer some sort of a diplomatic cover for Japan and South Korea to engage on sensitive issues like maritime norms, disaster response, and digital infrastructure, all under an inclusive multilateral umbrella. So this kind of cooperation exemplifies what I call soft alignment. So it's not a formal alliance. There are no treaties binding them, but it is instead informal, issue-based coordination that is flexible, pragmatic, and grounded on shared interests. And in today's Indo-Pacific, this might just be the most effective form of cooperation, especially for middle powers navigating the cross currents of geo or great power rivalry and historical baggages. No? So the question is, isn't all this coordination just US driven? Are Japan and South Korea really autonomous actors here? No. So to answer this quickly, while it is true that the United States plays a significant catalytic role in promoting trilateral cooperation, no, especially through high-profile summits like Camp David, etc., it would be, I think, reductive to view Japan-South Korea cooperation in Southeast Asia as merely an extension of U.S. policy. So what's evolving now is actually a convergence of priorities, which creates new opportunities for Japan and South Korea coordination. No? And while these alignments may be reinforced by US encouragement, they are not imposed by it. Instead, they reflect a growing sense of middle power responsibility and strategic pragmatism. No? So I guess in short, Japan and South Korea are not just reacting to US pressure, they're also co-creating regional norms and partnerships in ways that serve their own long-term interests. Now, Japan-South Korea cooperation in the Philippines actually thrives where politics are quiet. No? So you can see cooperation in the areas of education, for example. No? So one often overlooked aspect of Japan-Korea cooperation in the Philippines is academic diplomacy, no, or the long-term ties built through scholarship programs and alumni networks. So these networks actually, they go beyond socializing. They enable joint research, academic collaboration, and informal policy dialogue. And many alumni of, for example, MEX and GKS, or the South Korea's Global Korea Scholarship, they become scholars, diplomats, and leaders, and they contribute to the strengthening of the people-to-people ties among these three countries, Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, through shared academic experiences. Also, in the area of disaster response, so an example was in 2021, following Typhoon Odette. So both Japan and South Korea responded separately but in sync. So Japan through JICA, and then South Korea also provided cash aid and contributed to housing projects. No? Although there was no formal coordination, their efforts aligned through the UN system and again enabling parallel engagement. So that case during Typhoon Odette illustrated how or illustrates soft cooperation, low profile, politically neutral, yet impactful, showing how Tokyo and Seoul can actually work side by side in humanitarian efforts despite historical tensions. And then also in agriculture, agriculture is a sector often overlooked in strategic discussions, but are regarded nevertheless, vital to food security and rural development in the Philippines. So Japan, through its non-project grant aid, for example, donated 80 tractors and 48 mechanical planters to sugarcane farmers. And then South Korea, via COPIA, or Korea Program on International Agriculture, also built 2 greenhouses and an agribusiness facility in Nueva Ecija in partnership with Phil Rice. Okay, so again, although they are implemented separately, both initiatives were aligned in purpose, and that is to improve the food systems, support local economies, and build rural resilience in the Philippines. Okay, so this is another clear sign, I suppose, of Japan and South Korea learning to coexist, compete, and converge in ways that quietly strengthen the region. And then the last example, so there's a picture there, in 2024, Japan through JICA, Korea through KOICA, and the United States through USAID launched a 1.6 billion health project in the Bangsamoro in BARM, to improve primarily uh, the healthcare services in this region. And what sets this apart, this effort apart, is that it moves beyond parallel action. So it's a case of active trilateral coordination. No? Japan and South Korea and the US are working together deliberately and strategically. USAID's role as a neutral third party actually helped bridge historical and institutional divides, no, enabling Tokyo and Seoul to focus on shared development goals. So this is what scholars as they suggest. Now, these are small modular projects that can be scaled over time. They can build the foundation for deeper cooperation. So although they seem modest in appearance, these initiatives they foster habits of coordination, no? And this could eventually develop further in the future. Okay. But still, it's important to recognize that convergence has its limits, and those limits are often rooted in unresolved history. So the legacy of Japanese colonization in Korea continues to cast a long shadow. Issues like forced labor, the comfort women, and contested acts of memorialization flare up repeatedly, and they often derail even unrelated areas of cooperation. So these are not just emotional flashpoints, they are structurally embedded in each country's domestic politics and public memory. So in South Korea, progressive administrations tend to link foreign policy with historical justice, seeing reconciliation as incomplete unless past wrongs are fully acknowledged and addressed. But in contrast, many in Japan's conservative establishment insist that the matter has been settled through already in previous agreements, and any reopening of these issues are seen as politically destabilizing. So the result is a recurring cycle of mistrust, even when strategic interests are aligned. So we saw an example of this in 2018 when historical disputes spilled over into the security domain. So South Korea threatened to withdraw from the GSO-MIA, or the General Security of Military Information Agreement, and Japan, in response, imposed some export restrictions on South Korea. So this kind of linkage between past trauma and present policy is precisely what makes bilateral coordination so difficult. And this is probably why South Korea becomes crucial in this context. Because in Southeast Asia, Japan and Korea can engage one another indirectly, in third-party spaces, through multilateral platforms, and in less politicized domains. So the region offers a kind of diplomatic breathing room where historical baggage carries less weight and where cooperation can proceed pragmatically, even if reconciliation remains elusive. Okay, so let me end it with this. Japan and South Korea are not formal allies in the Indo-Pacific, but they are becoming strategic co-actors in a shared geopolitical theater, particularly in Southeast Asia. So their cooperation is not loud or treaty-bound. It is quiet, functional, and iterative, expressed in shared aid deliveries, parallel maritime exercises, and complementary infrastructure investments. And this partnership is what I call a quiet alliance of action, grounded not in history, but in habit, not in ideology, but in shared interests. And as great power competition intensifies and historical grievances persist, middle powers like Japan and South Korea are showing that soft alignment can yield hard outcomes, and that resilience can be built not in spite of history, but through a careful navigation of it. So that brings us to the end of my presentation. So thank you once again to Professor Kyung-Min Bae and the organizers of the Philippine Korean Studies Symposium, again, for the opportunity to share this work, even virtually. If you have any questions or feedback, please don't hesitate to email me. I'll do my best to respond as soon as possible. Okay, so again, thank you very much for your time and attention.
Presentation. We learned a lot. So at this point, let's now welcome the second presentation this afternoon, Mr. Joshua Bernard Espena from the Polytechnic University of the Philippines.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a true pleasure to be here. And sa karangalan ko na sumunod sa presentation ng aking thesis co-advisor. So I learned from the best. And thank you, Ma'am Tay, because you provided some of the points already. So that will save you a lot of time. So my paper is part of my endeavor to build my scholarly interest in naval diplomacy. And if anything, this is an extension of my my case study from my master thesis, because South Korea was not part of my case study. Now I'm presenting it before you with the title "Non-Priority or Lost Opportunity: South Korea's Naval Diplomacy with the Philippines in Strategic Perspective." So next slide, please. The following are my the scope will be the scope of my presentation. I'll introduce what's happening here, the puzzle I'm making, and the case I am making. And this will be followed by my research question and the argument, followed by the methodology, and then my findings, and some practical ways forward, and my conclusion from my study. So next slide. Navies are tools of international affairs. When we mean tools, we refer to these trinity roles: the military, constabulary, and diplomatic in character. Meaning to say, we cannot divorce ultimately the character of whatever navies do in the international affairs. Now, when we look at the current international system, it's beset by the US-China competition, of course, the maritime domain, and it puts naval diplomacy at the fore of this praxis of international relations. And when we say naval diplomacy, I'm using one of the latest definitions from Dr. Kevin Rogans's, the use of naval and maritime assets as communicative instruments of international power relationships to further the interests of one of the or more of the actors involved. So when we say naval diplomacy, we refer to various set of activities ranging from the soft spectrum, port visits alike, to the hard ones like joint exercises, interdiction, and naval strike to particular naval targets. Now, these activities nevertheless have one goal, that is to communicate a message. The communicative tones will either have three variations, either to coerce players, to co-opt players into one's fold, or a little bit of both, as long as one advances the foreign policy objectives. And why is it the case? Because it harks back to the intellectual legacy of Alfred Thaemar. It harks back still, nevertheless, to the sea power model, with the idea that there are geopolitical and economic opportunities at sea. That's why navies utilize this. Next slide. So, when you look at the literature on naval diplomacy, you'll find a breadth and depth or plethora of case studies. And indeed, there seems to be one common agreement. States indeed maximize naval diplomacy to get what they want: territorial integrity, trade creation or diversification, or creating industrial linkages, right? Especially on defense industries, and also regional and international security contribution. And there's a commonality amidst this literature on naval diplomacy. There seems to be a perfect formula that they're positing. The literature has this perfect formula. Number one is the availability of a large naval capability. When we say large, the ability of one to have, for somehow 1,000 to 1,500 tonnage of vessels able to strike targets from afar, from your shores, global power projections, to say the least. And second is the present systemic opportunities. That seems to be what I call a perfect formula from what they're suggesting. And the implication of which would be that only those passing these two criteria would have the capability to do naval diplomacy. And if you look at the screen before us, there seems to be a blunt assertion in the literature that only those major and medium-sized navies can do naval diplomacy. Two criteria. Next slide. However, the literature, what's happening in the literature is this. The perfect formula is but an abstraction rather than a universal one. Why? Because there's a curious case with regard to the Republic of Korea Navy. Number one, indeed, it is a large navy. It has its successful story of naval modernization, and according to IISS, from 1992 to 2022, it's one of the topmost naval tonnage contributor. Meaning to say, maraming barko operating in the Indo-Pacific waters. Secondly is that these ships contributing to the regional naval balance, most of them are high-tech and indigenous, as presented in the screen. They have this almost full capacity to produce ships because of their good shipbuilding capabilities since the 1970s. And these vessels and other platforms are nearly designed for blue water operations. Meaning to say, far from your shores. Almost near, the vision to operate like the United States, far from the shores. The second one, next slide please. The ROK Navy is also presented, there seems to be a systemic opportunity for them. That said, being a US ally, a large navy, they are a participant to the Rim of the Pacific exercises, or RIMPAC. And they're also a contributor to the Combined Task Force 151, a 41-nation naval coalition tasked to do counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden. Now, there's also a political guidance. Again, Dr. Tana provided this context for me. You have, for instance, Moon Jae-in's New Southern Policy and the NST Plus in 2020. You also have the evolution of President Yoon's Indo-Pacific sort of strategy launched in 2022, as presented in defense white papers, and also a large, deep relations with ASEAN through the ASEAN-Korea Dialogue, ASEAN Regional Forum, and also ASEAN Defense Minister Meeting Plus. And also, Global Korea Project. Their desire to project their ability as a middle power to shape the discourse on and shaping the rules-based international order. Such is the case of the MICTA, a five middle power arrangement comprising Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, and Australia. So, from what's happening here, it seems that the ROK Navy fits the two criteria. But let's move further. Next slide, please. Its engagements with the Philippines is a representative case that there might be something going on beyond what the literature is suggesting. Dr. Renato De Castro described it as the Maroc-Philippine relations as intense, deep, and comprehensive relations. But when you look at the granularity of naval diplomacy, perhaps we need to take this into perspective. Yes, multilaterally speaking, they are co-participants to the RIMPAC. They also hold discussions at the sides of various exercises like the Shield, Komodo exercises, right? But when you look at the bilateral level, engagements, naval diplomatic engagements are largely limited to naval arms sales. When you talk about naval arms sales, if you look at the data from Stockholm International Peace Research Initiative, or SIPRI, South Korea's defense products, indeed, it's booming. It's one of the rising powerhouses in the defense industry. But when you look at the naval arms, it's largely limited and mostly concentrated to the Philippines, within Southeast Asia. So, we can suggest here that yes, the Philippines' topmost import source is from South Korea, and South Korea, vice versa, holds the Philippines as one of its top destination of defense exports. So what's the point here? There may be other activities in naval diplomacy. There are port visits since 2019 for the reason that South Korean naval officers would want to do overseas cruise training. However, my argument is that these activities remain marginal to comprise a critical juncture. When I say critical juncture, we refer to the upscale of Philippine ROK naval diplomatic engagements, say naval exercises and towards defense industrial linkage and tech sharing. It remains marginal at this point of time. Why is this important? Because the Philippines, as we already noted, looks to like-minded partners to build a so-called collective deterrence, I would argue, to find partners to stand for the rules-based order because of it being at the front lines of Chinese revisionism. So, from the Philippine side, there seems to be an attitude that there has to be more of South Korean engagements. But there seems to be a problem. ROK does not reciprocate such. So the argument is this. The ROK seems to be underutilizing naval diplomacy with the Philippines. And puts me in a dilemma. Is it a non-priority for them or a lost opportunity for us? That's the framing of my work. And next slide. That's my research question. Why does ROK underutilizes naval diplomacy with the Philippines despite its large naval capability and available or present systemic opportunities? The argument here is, next slide, my working argument is that we need to look at these strategic institutions, making and executing strategies behind any kinetic action like naval diplomacy. There seems to be the inability of these institutions to bridge that naval means with its policy. In order to unpack this argument, next slide, here's my methodology. I utilize a qualitative single case study design. My analysis is located at the state level. My unit of analysis looks at the ROK strategic institutions making and executing strategies behind naval diplomacy, particularly with the Philippines. And took my sources from the following: document analysis and also KII from various scholars specializing in these three fronts. Now, also, of course, we also need to take into account the ethical compliance, so which I did in the course of my field work. So next slide. Allow me to present my framework. Indeed, the systemic and material approaches to understanding the current case fails to account such. And therefore, we need to introduce a new way of looking at the case study. I utilize General Theory of Strategy by Colin Gray and Jimmy Johnson, or GTS. GTS says that a security community or state may either decide not or be unable to do strategy purposefully unless it ties military power with its policy objectives. When you say tying up means strategizing, and when you strategize, you are held by context. It's presented in the framework. And you are also held by various considerations when you're executing any kinetic action. Because any kinetic action can result into the so-called strategic effect, which is defined as a cumulative and sequential impact upon the course of events, upon friends and adversaries alike. Meaning to say, may ginawa ka o wala kang ginawa, may magiging strategic effect. There will be a strategic effect. Alright, so the following are my findings. For the making of strategy, there are various contexts. Why does South Korea underutilize naval diplomacy? At the political level, they might agree about their middle power ascendance, but they still look at the DPRK as the central threat, which they emphasize that the US alliance should be emphasized in protecting South Korean interests in the peninsula. DPRK centrism. So there seems to be a bipartisan agreement. Yes, we need to rise as a middle power, but we also have concerns about dealing with North Korea. So we will prioritize that first. Either they do sunshine policy or engagement with North Korea or full deterrence, it's another matter. Nevertheless, the concern is that in reaching out to the Indo-Pacific region, we have already an agreement that we have a formidable defense industry complex comprising the government, the military, and the private sector. And this results in their outreach to the Philippines with a different threat perception. The Philippines perceives China as the most imminent threat, while ROK looks at the DPRK. So there's a different threat perception. At the social-cultural context, there seems to be a low maritime strategic culture amongst these strategic institutions. Meaning to say that, yes, there's this dependence on the ceiling of communications, and yet there seems to be a low level of consciousness that they need to be maritime-oriented. When we say low strategic culture, because there's still a demographic divide. There seems to be the notion that younger Koreans would have would have this perception that later on we can look at South Korea as a middle power. But right now, the leaders, mostly the relatively older generations, still looks at the DPRK threat. Nevertheless, so if in this social cultural context, would result in what you call lack of empathy on understanding the Philippine side for wanting to do more. Economically speaking, yes, they are an industrial, because of their heavy dependence on the channel of communications for energy and trade, and there's also lucrative arms sales. That's the reason why they're largely limited to naval arms sales. Technologically speaking, they're trying to project to the world about their idea of they're now indigenized and they're high-tech, and therefore we can incorporate this into our defense, overall defense system. This is how we want other countries like the Philippines for us to be perceived on, that we are high-tech. Particularly, it's Defense Innovation 4.0, and the idea that AI, cloud computing, and other future technologies will be integrated. Relatedly, you have the military context, whereby, yes, they have the so-called Navy Vision 2045, the projection towards blue water operations. But since there's a DPRK centrism on threat perception, they remain near sea defense oriented. Meaning to say, even if they have created a massive, large naval capability, most of which are still deployed near sea operations. Geographically, as an island, because they're blocked off to the rest of the peninsula, they look to the SLOC of the larger maritime Indo-Pacific. And when they go out to these waters, they are held by various concerns with Chinese and DPRK incursions in the Yellow Sea. And with that, there's also, when they go down furthermore, they're also concerned with the United States becoming more focused on the Taiwan Strait scenario, right? That this kind of scenario would certainly have implications for the defense of the peninsula. And historically, they're held back by the memorialization of the Korean War. Meaning to say, even while they were trying to aim for a global Korea project, they're still held by various incidents, like the Yongbyon incidents, the Cheonan incidents, right? It resulted with them scaling back their vision from a blue water back to the green water operations. Next slide, please. As a result, whenever they execute strategies, it seems that ROK institutions are disinterested in what we call overstretch or strategic distraction, according to one of the sources. Meaning to say, they're still preoccupied with the DPRK, but they also take into account that the DPRK and China might be having a strategic collaboration. Whether how it's taking form is unknown, but they are aware, but still, they look to DPRK as the main source of the threat. Meaning to say, they try to avoid two-front wars because they cannot afford a high-intensity conflict outside the Korean Peninsula. Within the peninsula, they accept that scenario. Willing sila mag-throw out ng many resources. And time, of course. Yes, there might be transformation on the force structure. In Jeju Island, there's a new command there, but historically speaking, the change remains slow. So, logistics-wise, there's also concern about Taiwan Strait scenario, nightmare scenario, might allow the DPRK to exploit that to move forward to the Korean Peninsula downwards. And moreover, there seems to be incompatibility on the C4 ISR, command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance ISR capability. So there seems to be a lack of compatibility. And resulting in military doctrine that remains to be green water operations. And lastly, they're resulting in these strategy breachers, or these people trying to maintain control of this strategy. There seems to be, amongst ROK institutions, their inability to reach common maritime norms. Interestingly, one of my sources said that while the Philippines opts for multilateral approach in resolving dispute with China, South Korea prefers to have this yellow sea model of bilateralism with China. There's one source who mentioned that South Korea does not really care about the Philippines utilizing UNCLOS because South Korea did its own model even outside the UNCLOS. There's that kind of notion. So, next slide please. In other words, there seems to be a disconnect, right? The Philippines wants to do more, but South Korea doesn't feel like it, extending beyond naval arms. The way forward, of course, is a new institutional mindset or strategic culture. Meaning to say, they need to work on common maritime norm. How? Of course, it's two-tier, top-down and bottom-up. It's presented on the screen. And perhaps the need to work on more low-hanging fruits to reach this common threat perception so that they might reach a favorable strategic effect in doing naval diplomacy. At the political, shared realities, operational interoperability, and technical on industrial linkage to sustain the effort moving forward. And to conclude, my case study provides an alternative understanding on how might states utilize naval diplomacy absent the two criteria presented in the current literature. So, a non-priority or a lost opportunity, it depends on who you are asking. For the Philippines, it might be a lost opportunity if there's no upscale for the next years to come. But for the South Korean side, perhaps it's a non-priority so far. Perhaps they might have to do prioritization. Should they shape the order? Should they deter the TPRK threat? Or perhaps put the House in order, especially post-impeachment. So, thank you so much for your attention and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you for that very interesting lecture. So now, with that, let's call on our third and last presenters this afternoon. From the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Santo Tomas, let's have Mr. Manuel Antonio Sala and Elijah Justin Soriano.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Elijah Justin Soriano, alongside with my thesis partner, Manuel Sala. And it is an honor to present our research titled Unveiling the Evolution of Korean Wave, a policy analysis and involvement of Chaebol from Park Guinea to Moon Jae-in era from 2013 to 2022. And now, without further ado, let us begin with the background study. The Korean Wave, or Hallyu, has become a global cultural force driven by the rise of K-pop, dramas, and other creative industries. Since 2013, the South Korean government has strategically promoted Hallyu as a tool for soft power and economic development, notably under Park Geun-hye's administration. Through institutions like the Hallyu Ministry, the state has actively shaped cultural policy to foster global influence and economic growth. Rooted in South Korea's developmental state model, this approach emphasizes public-private cooperation, especially with powerful conglomerates known as chaebols, to advance national industries and expand cultural reach. Despite growing literature on this topic, field studies fully examine how government policy and chaebol involvement intersect to drive Hallyu's global rise. This research fills that gap by analyzing the interplay of the developmental state, chaebols, and cultural policy from 2013 to 2022, covering the administrations of Park Geun-hye and Moon Jae-in.
Next slide, please.
For our questions, we have formulated, or for us proponents, we have formulated this question: how did the South Korean government from Park Geun-hye to Moon Jae-in administration in collaboration with South Korean chefs reinforce the Korean Wave phenomenon through policy making from the year 2013 to 2022? To be further guided with this study, the proponents intend to seek and understand policy initiatives, regulatory frameworks, and lastly, economic strategies implemented by answering the following sub-questions. What are the policies implemented during the administration of Park Geun-hye and Moon Jae-in in relation to Korean Wave? What were the roles of the South Korean government and its agencies in relation to chaebols involving the Korean Wave according to their policies that they have implemented? Next is, how did the chaebols employ their political influence through cultural exchange and partnership with state agencies? And lastly, what were the outcomes of the South Korean cultural policies from Park Geun-hye to Moon Jae-in administration? Next slide. Here are the objectives and significance of our study. For going now to our theoretical framework. Next slide, please.
To further understand our paper, let's turn to the theoretical framework. To ground our study, we use Peter Evans' concept of embedded autonomy in 1995, which explains how the relationship between the state and the private sector can shape industrial development. According to Evans, successful development requires a balance. The state must be embedded enough to work closely with private actors, yet autonomous enough to pursue long-term national goals independently. Evans outlines 4 roles of the state can play. First is the midwife, supporting private sector growth through policies and incentives. Second, husbandry, sustaining competitive industries through collaboration and innovation. Third is the custodian, regulating markets to align private actions with public goals. And lastly, the leverage, directly producing in high-risk sectors when private investment is lacking. This roles shows how the state can drive industrial development not just by stepping in, but strategically partnering with the private sector.
Next slide, please. For our conceptual. With this theory in mind, now we move on to our conceptual framework. This applies the study of Peter Evans' theory, embedded autonomy, to analyze the relationship between the South Korean government and chaebols in promoting the Korean Wave or Hallyu. Key aspects of this framework include the state-private sector relationship. The framework highlights the concept of the state embeddedness within the society, emphasizing how the government interactions with key actors, economic actors, specifically chaebols, influence economic and cultural outcomes. Next is the impact on industrial development. This theory posits that varying degrees of state embeddedness and autonomy can significantly affect industrial development, which in this context relates to the cultural industries aimed into promoting and Hallyu. The framework serves as a lens through which the study examines how the collaboration and dynamics between state agencies and chaebols contribute to the establishment and growth of the Korean Wave, focusing on policy making that enhances cultural exports and influence. Next slide, please. Now we have these findings. First is the policies per administration. As you can see on your screen, we have divided the policies per administration. During Park Geun-hye's administration, South Korean government implemented a series of pivotal policies aimed at leveraging Hallyu for economic and cultural advancement. Key initiatives include creative economy, the Hallyu 3.0, creative economy private-public initiative, the second basic plan of promoting the content industry, and lastly, the cultural creation and convergence law. For Moon Jae-in's administration, it's built upon the foundations laid by Park Geun-hye's administration, furthering the agenda of Hallyu through both cultural and diplomatic means. Through the Cultural Vision 2030 Cultural Review Months, New Southern Policy, Adventure Investment Fund, and Content Industry Medium and Long-Term Vision, and lastly, Copyright Vision 2030. Together, this administration showcased the concrete efforts to position Hallyu not just a cultural phenomenon, but as well as a strategic economic driver for South Korea, with effective partnership between state and private sectors. Next slide.
Now, this slide illustrates how the South Korean government has played the 4 key roles in the globalizations of its cultural industries: as midwife, husbandry, custodian, and leverage. First, as a midwife or facilitator, the state helped expand Hallyu by creating favorable conditions for the cultural industry. Under Park Geun-hye, this meant direct government intervention through programs like Hallyu 3.0, cultural centers abroad, and funding for content producers. In contrast, Moon Jae-in took a more market-driven approach by reducing barriers for the private sectors and promoting Korean content via streaming platforms like Netflix through his new Southern policy. Next, as husbandry or nurturer, the state nurtured the industry with funding and infrastructure. Parks administration set up creative economy and innovation centers to support startups, while Moon's administration emphasized venture capital investment and regional development to spread creative growth beyond Seoul. Moon also pushed for fair labor practices in the industry. As a custodian regulator, both administrations protected the integrity of Korean content. Park emphasized cultural protectionism, content quotas, and anti-piracy efforts. Meanwhile, Moon focused on corporate responsibility, ensuring fair contracts, artist welfare, and privacy protections in the digital space. And lastly, as a generation producer, Park's government directly launched state-led projects like the Culture Creation and Convergence Belt to create content. Moon, however, stepped back from direct production and instead promoted international co-productions and cultural diplomacy through initiatives like the New Southern Policy. Together, these roles show how the state actively shaped Halley's global rise through different leadership styles, shifting from direct control to enabling private sector and international collaboration.
Next slide, please. So starting off with the cultural exchange for midwife, as an on-the-screen strategic role of CJ Group and major chapels in collaboration with government cultural policies are one example. Chapels, particularly the CJ Group, have utilized the political connections to foster cultural exchange and collaborate with state agencies reinforcing Hallyu as a national asset. This involves transcending mere business growth, reflecting a commitment align with government-led cultural policies. Next. Another evidence of the digital for midwife is the digital transformation and global reach, as well as a product placement and cultural branding. While the rise of Korean Wave via social media or over-the-top platforms like Netflix, View, and Disney have facilitated strategic collaboration leveraging digital technology, enhancing Korean Wave's role as a soft power tool in global cultural discourse. Brands like Samsung have incorporated their products into popular K-dramas, enhancing brand visibility while promoting South Korean culture supported by favorable international trade policies. Next. For the husbandry, private-public synergies and enhancing Hallyu infrastructure was evident in this role. Hallyu have engaged in public-private partnerships to combine corporate strategies with government initiatives. For instance, CJ partnered with Seoul Metropolitan Government in 2018 to contribute to the I Heart Seoul branding campaign. This collaboration has positioned CJ as a key player in enhancing Seoul's global image while supporting Hallyu-related events. Such partnership signals the government's acceptance of Chebos as essential collaborators in promoting South Korean culture internationally, showcasing their significant influence in shaping cultural diplomacy. Next, for the custodian, institutional collaboration and soft power through cultural branding was common for this role. Chebos have significant control over the South Korean film industry, with key players like CJ, Lotte, and Orion dominating almost 80% of the market. The government has aided these companies in international efforts as attended by support of CJ film Parasite, which won an Oscar. This collaboration reflects to the government how governments such as the Korean Film Center and KCC work alongside with Chebos to enhance the global presence of South Korean cultural content. The promotion of K-pop stars alongside with brand initiatives further the goal of enhancing South Korea's soft power. Next, and lastly, for the demiurge, state endorsement and support as well as digital innovation is seen in this role. During challenges like COVID-19 pandemic, Chebos demonstrated an adaptability by continuing to collaborate with governments to maintain Hallyu's momentum. Initiatives such as the launch of K-Contact in 2020 by CJENM created a virtual platform for cultural exchange during events cancellations. The government recognized the importance of sustaining cultural influence, supporting Chebos' investments in content creation that increase production capacity and global reach, showcasing the effectiveness of the private-public partnership, fostering cultural industries even during the challenging times. Next slide.
For our findings to the outcomes of cultural policy, South Korea's cultural policies under Park Geun-hye and Moon Jae-in turned the cultural sector into a key economic driver, backed by strong public and private investment and fueled by Halley's global appeal. This period saw major gains in GDP, exports, jobs, and FDI. One standout result, the growth in cultural content sales and exports. From 2018 to 2022, industry sales rose by 22.5% from 119.9 trillion Korean won to 146.9 trillion Korean won, while exports soared 35.2% from 96.2 billion US dollars to 130.1 billion US dollars. Moon's Digital New Deal, launched in 2022, injected 5.8 trillion Korean won into digital content, boosting global reach despite the pandemic. In fact, in 2020 alone, cultural exports grew 16.3%, outpacing the national average. This shows just how vital the cultural industry has become in South Korea's economic strategy. Next slide, please. The Korean Wave, or Hallyu, became a strong economic engine under both Park and Moon. Government support and global streaming partnership boosted exports, growing Hallyu-related exports by 13.7% annually from 2017 to 2021, outpacing overall national export growth. K-pop alone brought over $756 million US dollars by 2020. Netflix Squid Game made a $900 million US dollars global impact, showing the high returns of Korean content. Hallyu also fueled tourism to 1.1 million Hallyu-driven visitors in 2019, generated 7.5 trillion Korean won in revenue. The cultural sector's share of GDP rose from 2.6% in 2013 to 4.1% by 2022. Job creation was another major gain, with 30,000 new jobs added yearly and 650,000 people employed by 2020, including 80,000 in gaming. FDI surged too. Media-related investment rose 44% from 2017 to 2021, reaching 2.1 billion US dollars. And Netflix alone invested 500 million US dollars in 2021, backing hits like Squid Game and Hellbound. Next slide, please. At the micro level, cultural policies under Park Geun-hye and Moon Jae-in directly influenced public engagement with Korean culture, both locally and globally. This was evident in rising fan participation, cultural tourism, language learning, and digital content consumption, each bringing economic benefits. K-pop and K-dramas were key tools. Moon's Digital New Deal in 2020 strengthened online content platforms, helping dramas like Crash Landing on You and Kingdom gain global popularity as well. Squid Game became Netflix's most watched series in 2021, driving interest in Korean language, food, and fashion. It generated over $891 million US dollars in value from just $21 million US dollars production budget. Private companies also thrived. From 2020 to 2022, the Big Four agencies, HYBE, SM, JYP, and YG, saw major revenue increases fueled by global tours, streaming, and merchandise sales. These outcomes show how cultural policy backed by industry innovation turned K-pop and K-dramas into global economic and soft power assets for South Korea. Next slide, please. Beyond K-pop and K-drama, South Korea's cultural policy also invested in education, entrepreneurship, and tourism. Government-run King Sejong Institutes and Korean cultural centers expanded globally with over 213 Sejong Institutes in 75 plus countries by 2021. This promoted language learning and cultural engagement. Platforms like Duolingo saw 40% spike in Korean learners in the US after the success of Squid Game and BTS releases. Park Geun-hye launched the Creative Economy Initiative, supporting over 3,000 cultural startups by 2016. Moon Jae-in's Digital New Deal continued with this with 5.8 trillion Korean won in funding for immersive digital content. Webtoons like Sweet Home and All of Us Are Dead became global hits through Netflix. Cultural tourism also thrived. In 2019 alone, 1.1 million tourists visited Korea for Hallyu-related experiences, generating 7.5 trillion Korean won in revenue. Regions like Busan and Jeonju turned cultural assets like film festivals and traditional villages into sustainable tourism engines. These policies deepened cultural engagement, promoted regional development, and contributed to South Korea's global cultural influence and economic growth.
Next slide, please. For our conclusion, this study explored on how South Korean government, in partnership with chaebols like CJ, Samsung, and Lotte, strategically advanced the Korean way from 2015 to 2022. Using Peter Evans' theory embedded autonomy, the proponents found that both the Park Geun-hye administration and Moon Jae-in's administration played complementary roles in supporting Hallyu. Park through innovation-driven policies like the creative economy, and Moon through inclusive initiatives such as the Digital New Deal. Importantly, chaebols weren't passive recipients of the state support. They were co-architects. They provided infrastructure, global networks, and capital to amplify the state's cultural strategies. The synergy between the state leadership and private sector innovation helped turn K-pop, K-dramas, and other cultural exports into pillars of South Korea's global influence and economic success. Overall, this collaboration reflects a developmental state that is both autonomous and deeply embedded in the private sector networks, making Korea's cultural policy model unique and effective. Based on our findings, the researchers proposed three main directions for future researchers. Theoretical expansion. Beyond embedded autonomy, future scholars could explore other frameworks like network governance or digital statecraft to better capture the complexity of modern cultural policy. Next, the empirical depth. Access to internal policy documents and legislative archives, which would deepen analysis on how cultural strategies and development are debated. And lastly, mixed methods approach. Combining qualitative and quantitative data as well as interviews with stakeholders would strengthen the reliability and real-world applicability of future studies. In summary, South Korea's cultural rise was not accidental. It was a strategically move built through state building or state business collaboration, offering a powerful model for other countries aiming to turn cultural into global influence. That concludes our presentation for today, entitled Unveiling the Evolution of South Korea's Korean Way of Policy Analysis and Involvement of Chaebols from Park Geun-hye to Moon Jae-in from 2015 to 2022.
This part is very interesting. There are a lot of interesting insight in this group of papers that we had this afternoon. So let me first start by opening the floor. Let me open the floor to our audience. Maybe you have questions. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes. Please introduce yourself and then.
Hi, I'm Ray Evangelista from the Mediation Center of Korean region. I wanted to ask the last presenter. So I really enjoyed this panel particularly. Also, I guess it's because it's where my research interests lie. But for the last presenters, because I also was trying to do research on cultural policy involving the government and the channels. So it's great seeing the presenters already. I'm having predicted myself. But something I wanted to ask, I guess two questions, is first, were you able to also see how the interactions between the government and the channels work? Like, is it the government approaching the private sector and asking them, we invest naman kayo here? Or is it a private sector going to the government asking, or like offering that, okay, we have capabilities in this sector, we can help. I guess it leads to the question also, is it just coincidental that the private sector and the government both have their own initiatives? Government more on soft power, the private sector more on their branding and corporate gain, or is it something that's deliberate, like it's something that's work together? Second question, how do you think? Do you think this is something that's sustainable, or how sustainable do you think is the charitable investment in Hallyu, given that market trends shift, and government priorities also change. Like if we would add in like the current administration, that's a lot shaky. We don't really see a lot of talk when it comes to cultural policy or creative industry. So two questions. Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Okay. Frankly speaking, one of our hindrances with our study is we found a limited, or we were blocked with the access to policies and also literature, given that I'm not really sure if we are looking at the right websites, or even if Korea really publishes their laws directly on their websites. But based on our journal articles that we have seen, or basically basing from what we have, we've seen that there was no really, well, actually we really don't know if who really approached first, if it's the private ones or the government ones. But as we can see it, we believe that there's a mutual understanding between those two. So I believe that for future researchers, that would be the one, or they would be exploring to that area regarding whether who approaches first, or who does it, who actually starts or makes the initiative on making the policy or making the collaboration. For your second question, based from our data from 2018 to 2022, we've seen a massive growth, 32% if I'm not mistaken. So that's 18, 20, 2022. So that's 5 years. So for 5 years of data, we've seen a drastic growth for 32%. The sustainability-wise of the project or the initiatives between the chairpods and also government. Personally, I cannot say if it's sustainable for up to 10 years, but with the given data, I guess we can see it, or we can a trajectory of a little more 3 or 4 years from now, it would be okay. But other than that, we're not sure, because again, as you said, the trends shift. Sorry, you want
Just to add on that, when we were doing our research, we really had a hard time looking for policies. We just relied to the articles we found on the website. Well, we found a very good website like the Korean Information Center, but of course I think it is very limited because we cannot understand Korean language. But I mean, there is translation there. Still, I think it really limits us. So yeah.
Actually, maybe just to add also in her answer, last year we had Professor Shekunu. He's actually known for that. So if you go back to his literature, you'll find that it's actually there was a demand from the Korean public. And that's why the government had to do something about it and had these policies on creative industry. So that was actually the beginning of this. And then also, with regards to Korea improving their creative policies, based on our research, just to add also, it's actually that the Korean government has been trying to align their initiatives with UNESCO and other international initiatives. And that's why the creative policies, the creative economy is actually already in place or outlined by the government. So you could also share that. Although, of course, Sir also knows about this because it's part also of his research. So that's something that we could add also to your discussion. Anything else, or maybe okay, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Manny Manuel from the Garapa School of Business. Just to take off from the question earlier, and to also expand it to the second presenter. We know that things aren't going well for the South Korean government at this particular point in time. There's a lot of things going on, and I guess the question is, for both studies and for both research interests, is how does the current situation impact on, one, the ability to be able to see if there's anything about naval diplomacy, and then of course the whole area of creative policies, given that things are not in a good state at this particular time with the South Korean government.
This is for both
Yes,
papers.
this is for both
papers.
Good question. When I was conducting my fieldwork, when various good question, sir. When I was conducting my fieldwork on this one, there's a general sentiment amongst them. For one, indeed, there's a looming uncertainty. Perhaps the more progressive side would win the presidential election, or perhaps another Yoon in the setting. Nevertheless, there's this one caveat. It seems that South Korea cannot go back to what it once was. The international order has now been deteriorated. The idea that PRC and the DPRK is notably collaborating, at least a shared vision. They're operating now on a shared vision, not just about deterring South Korea's stability, but also rewriting the entire Indo-Pacific maritime order. So that was a lot of implications on South Korea's naval diplomatic side. And that was a lot of pressure actually on the institutions. There's a systemic change. The question is whether can ROK institutions in charge with this strategy-making endeavors to be able to change as well. Which is why I go back full circle to my point. Perhaps there needs to be a maritime cultural change on this one. And my take is that perhaps we can help, the Philippine side can help the South Koreans on this matter. While they're still looking for the next president, perhaps at the diplomatic table, perhaps the Philippine side, Manila can help on this one to clarify that there needs to be some sort of revision from your security calculus, and hence capture the opportunity representing as well to the South Koreans. Thank you, sir.
You want to add to the answer? You want to add? Okay. Okay, so maybe just add also in the discussion earlier. So you mentioned about the Philippines, or maybe the question of why there's a lack of engagement in terms of naval diplomacy in both countries. That the Philippines and South Korea has been focused in terms of acquiring weapons, especially conventional weapons, so in terms of naval diplomacy. Probably because it also goes back to the Philippine side, that the Philippines has always been focused on our traditional alliances, especially on the US. It was only when we started talking about the independent foreign policy, if you remember, 2012, 2013, that was the time when we started to engage with other partners like Australia, Japan, and even South Korea. And maybe that's why also, in terms of hard engagement, that's where we are still lacking at this point. And now with the new policies, we are starting to recognize or consider the alliances or the other forms of engagements with South Korea and the Philippines.
Can I add one more thing? It's an interesting point that we are here right now, because the jury's still out there though. Some are saying perhaps the Duterte administration was a phase we had to go through. Whether we agree on this notion or otherwise, it's still out for debate, but nevertheless, you mentioned rightly that traditional alliance with the United States is kind of problematic in a sense that we put our eggs in the American basket. Of course, I do not belong to the side of the fence of discarding the Americans away, but we need to take a more moderate position. At the top tier level, or at least at the bottom, the bedrock of our diplomatic outreach, we still undergird the U.S. security alliance. But you have to understand, in my conversations with many American scholars, it seems that Americans too would like to have Philippines to have more agency on the matter. In fact, the Philippines convening other countries to do these things, blah, 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 is something much more of an American interest. Right now, with the Republicans trying to withered away from some sort of global engagements. It's within the Americas, within Washington's interests to see the Filipinos, Filipino elites and institutions in general, try to work out a carved network of engagements with each other. The only question with whether this will happen is, in my perspective, is on the logistics side. It's easy to say that we stand for the rules-based order, but let's look at the logistics side. Can we sustain this? That's why we need to look beyond alliances and perhaps invite the South Koreans. Perhaps they can put some of their industries in. But again, the question though, when I ask a certain scholar, the question is the redundancy issue. Would the Korean Navy accept the fact that many of their logistical supply chain would be here in the Philippines? In case of a scenario that DPRK attacks South Korea, would it be an acceptable scenario that there's so much time to be wasted, time to sustain? Nevertheless, I think that's the point. In the 2020s, 2030s, 2040s onward, we're still in this stage of trying to convince other countries that there's something brewing here in this side of the world, that the Philippines has a great stakes. And I think that's where I'm coming from, hence my study, my working paper on this one.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Sir Eric has a question.
Eric Abstra, UP Barangay School of Business. Well, it's actually two things. First, some suggestions on where you can look for that. Thank you. Yeah. First is like suggestion where you look for that data for the policy. Because like one thing is always like, at least from my side of the field, which is the business, tax incentives is probably like a big carrot. Because I remember, if I remember correctly, back in 2020, there was some talk regarding giving tax incentives, aside from the subsidies, tax incentives to any Korean business was involved in exporting Korean made content. And so I don't know what happened to that. So probably that's one lead I can give you. Like maybe look at what the CJ group intended to do. And because it's good that you mentioned CJ because they're the ones who actually has the biggest in terms of promotion, which is KCON. Okay, so yeah, and rumor has it that what happens is the host country has an organizer, private organizer. They get funding from the Korea Foundation, and then they use that money to shoulder the cost of hosting KCON. That's anecdotal. Right? It's actually anecdotal. So probably that is a lead that you may wanna validate for one. And then secondly, probably also because if there's one thing that I also triggered, during while listening to your presentation is that what's in it for the likes of Netflix and Spotify to invest in Korean made content? Like what's in it for Netflix? Was there any concessions from the Korean government, any special incentive or any special tax break, whatever, that really like allowed Netflix to pour in that much money into helping to produce Korean dramas? And also in the same way, like how did Spotify? What was the carrot for Spotify to partner with Melon so that we have Kakao Music so that we can have K-pop songs in Spotify. Right? So I haven't thought about it until now. And thank you for your presentation for triggering those questions in my head. So probably those are probably some of the leads that I can give you and questions that we can ask further, so that we can have like a more solid connection between policy making. So there's a policy. What was the actual regulation? What was the actual incentive for Korean companies to go abroad? And secondly, to have foreign companies like Netflix and Spotify to come in and invest in Korean content.
Would you like to answer that?
Actually, I have an input. Hi, sir. Thank you for your input and for your advice. Honestly, what really gave us input or realization regarding this one, or for OTT platforms like Netflix and also Disney, was films or dramas having the logos of the Korean Cultural Ministry at the end. Yes, at the end. Or if you're gonna see some dramas starting off in partnership or in collaboration with this specific ministry.
Alright, right.
We have those in the dramas. But the problem is we cannot look or we can't see any data to answer that. There's no memorandum. There's a lack of memorandum stating it. There's lack of documents or policies up on the internet for us to be guided with it. So actually, that's one of our recommendations na for future researchers to delve more or to go through the National Archives of the Congress of Korea to further check regarding the memorandum of agreements or understanding between the government and also the or platforms like Spotify, Apple Music, and whatsoever. So I hope I answered your question.
I think remember, sir, there was a lecture before organized by SNUAC. The question was, is Netflix riding on Hallyu or Hallyu riding on Netflix?
Yes.
If I remember that,
Yeah.
I just...
And they have a part 2 this year.
This year, okay. So that would be very interesting. Anyway, I know we have a lot of questions to this panel. It's very interesting. However, we don't have any more time to accommodate more. So maybe we can just end this part by the awarding of certificates to our presenters. Just first read the citation, which is of course for all. The certificate of application is presented to Joshua Bernard P. Estrella for presenting his paper at the 2025 Philippine Korean Studies Symposium, a decade of Korean studies in the Philippines, a glance at the past, a gaze at the present, a glimpse of the future, held at the University of the Philippines, Quezon City, Philippines. Awarded on the 28th of April 2025, signed Kyung Min Bae, PhD, Director of UP Korea Research Center. This is now for Mr. Manuel Antonio Gisala. Okay, and then Mr. Elijah Justin Soriano. Congratulations to our presenters. Can we have the for our picture with All right, thank you for that. So